Hi, Misha here, and this is one I thought might be kind of fun and interesting to do. And with a new camera and whatnot, why not? I thought we'd look at the A series aircraft from the U.S. Air Force, U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps. These are aircraft that were primarily designed for ground attack. We have some light attack and some medium attack. Some are designed more for close air support. Some were originally designed more as bombers or nuclear bombers. But none of these are what you would consider dogfighters. Over here we have the A1. Then we have the A4. We have the A5, or rather RA5. Next we have the A6. Then we have the A7. And then we have the AV8. Then we have the A10. And then finally we have the FA-18. I considered bringing out the Super Hornet too, but yeah, I think this is enough and whatnot. And this really kind of takes us from the end of World War II through present day, and I think is the majority of what really were used in large numbers. There were a few others like the A3, Douglas A3, that didn't see a lot of use, and things like the YA9 never went into full production. And so I thought we would kind of just give a few minutes to each of these, focusing on their attributes as far as ground attack, close air support, what have you, payload. And if you'd like a more detailed history, I've done videos in the past on almost all of these. With that, let's get started. The Douglas A1 Skyraider. Although it was originally known as the AD for much of its life and production for Attack Douglas, the original designation, this was created for the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps as a dedicated attack and close air support aircraft. It really is an outgrowth of World War II, kind of the culmination of all the torpedo and dive bombers, replacing planes like the TBF Avenger, SB-2C Helldiver, and it was designed where it could deliver torpedoes, bombs, what have you. And with this, they decided that a single-seater was sufficient, that having extra crew like a gunner, a bombardier, just took up space. They also decided that having an internal bomb bay was unnecessary. Instead, it had 15 hardpoints, all external, most under the wings, and it could carry up to 14,000 pounds in ordnance. It also had 4 20mm cannon, although early planes might have had only 2. This was the last so-called tail dragger in the U.S. Navy, and it was designed to operate off of carriers. It just started to eke into production when World War II ended, but unlike a lot of late war projects, they did go ahead and authorize low-rate production, which was ramped up before the Korean War. And between 1946 and around 1957, they would produce nearly 3,200 of these. This was the primary attack aircraft used by the Navy off carriers during the Korean War. Also, the U.S. Marine Corps used it for close air support. She was designed to fly low and slow, having good low speed maneuverability, and something that would be very important for this kind of aircraft, good loiter time. In fact, her top speed was only about 325 miles per hour. And her maximum altitude was only a bit over 28,000 feet. She's quite large, at about 39 feet long, with a wingspan of just at 50 feet. So really her most impressive attributes were simply her ruggedness, dependability, and also she was armored quite well for her day and time. And could really be a hard hitter. Even though production was over and there was talk about removing her from service, she was still the Navy's medium attack aircraft when the Vietnam War began, as was also used by the Marine Corps. And the U.S. Air Force would inherit some A-1s, as they started to become known as after 1962. And they would operate them throughout the Vietnam War, although the Navy would pretty much have these retired out of frontline service by 1968. The Air Force would use these for close air support, but also escort missions to recover downed pilots. In fact, over 3,800 aircrew were saved thanks to the use of the A-1, or as it was sometimes known, the Hobo, or the Sandy, or the Spad, because yeah, they recognize this. It looks like a World War II plane. So this flying in Vietnam was pretty eye-catching. But it could deliver a lot of ordnance. It was tough, and it could come in low and slow, sometimes better than a jet. And of course, operation costs were relatively light compared to newer aircraft. And they would go through several versions, up to about the E, the H, and so forth. But that's a story for a more in-depth video. But this is really the first A in the Joint Services naming system. And it's from Douglas. And this model, like most of these, is from Hobbymaster, 1/72 scale. It has opening canopy, well, sliding rather. If I can do it, it's a little stiff. Come on. I don't want to fight with it right now, but it slides back, it's just a little stiff. And it has gear up or down. Of course, it has a rotating propeller like all Hobbymaster prop planes. And it has removable ordnance. They have several versions. This is an Air Force from Vietnam, but they've done quite a few, including the famous toilet bowl bombing one from 1965. Anyway, after the Vietnam War, these are taken out of Air Force service and allowed to retire with dignity. But yeah, this kind of started a trend and a new wave, a new type of aircraft. So let's move on. We have another from Douglas, the A4 Skyhawk, and before 1962 known as the A4D, where the A1 was designed to be more of a medium attack aircraft. This was designed to be a light attack aircraft, and the first dedicated attack aircraft with a jet engine. And its development dates back at Douglas and in the Navy to the Korean War era. They wanted a new jet capable of delivering both conventional and also nuclear ordnance. Originally, it was a daytime only, daylight only aircraft, although later versions would get updates to their avionics and radar to make them more all-weather. This is a very small aircraft, only about 40 feet long and only about 27.5 feet for a wingspan. It has this delta wing, type configuration with a tail. Pretty unique for an American fighter. It did have two 20mm Colt Mark 12 cannon, originally with 100 rounds. Late versions would have 200 rounds per cannon. But its main thing was, of course, its ordnance. Originally it had 3 hard points, 1 under each wing plus belly. Later versions would be given 5 hard points, 2 under each wing, and sometimes older planes would be updated. Initially, the Navy just wanted this to be able to carry about 2,000 pounds, but they would update their requirements. And really, in every way, Douglas really came in ahead. This came in at half the required weight, under cost, under budget, and on time, which is something you don't hear for government projects much anymore, right? And after some updates, as they switch from the original A4A, B, and this is a C here, and they get into the more advanced versions like the E, updating engines, they were able to carry 6,000 and even 8,000 pound loads. The aircraft was just dirt simple and effective. It didn't even need folding wings, it was so small. It not derisively, but it was often called the scooter or the tinker toy because of its small size. And this was the Navy's primary light attack aircraft in 1964. It had gone into service around 57, and main production would last until 1979, and they would build just shy of 3,000 of these. So it would start off as a Douglas design, but the last ones, the A4Ms, would be built under the McDonell-Douglas name. The Marines, too, quickly adopted it after the Navy. They used it to support their troops on the ground. The Navy would fly theirs off carriers. Speaking of its small size and relatively lightweight, meant it could operate from older World War II era carriers like the Essex class, whereas newer jets, like the one we're going to look at next, had to operate from more modern carriers, nuclears and whatnot. Even though it was small and effective enough, it did have quite a nice bombing system for the time called LABS, Low Altitude Bombing System. It was also one of the first, if not the first, U.S. Navy aircraft to pioneer the whole buddy refueling system. So what they would do, one would go up loaded up with 3 external fuel tanks. Others would take off the deck, fully loaded with ordnance, and then they would get topped off by the A4 and then go to their target to give them best range, best fuel. This is before there were truly dedicated tankers on aircraft carriers. And yeah, these would often carry Zuni rockets, dumb fire bombs, or dumb drop bombs, iron bombs. Later they would be equipped to fire the bullpup missile. While they could fight, this was a ground attacker, and that's what they were meant for. And they were used very extensively in Vietnam. In 1967, there was the USS Forrestal incident where an A4 accidentally fired a Zuni rocket while on the deck, starting a fire that resulted in a lot of injuries and some death. And really by 1968-69, the Navy was pulling these out of some service, finally retiring it at a front line by 1976. But the U.S. Marine Corps would keep on not only using it, but they would take deliveries of updated versions, like I said, the A4M, all the way through 1979. The Navy would keep them around throughout the 80s and 90s for training and reserve use and just to have, because they are durable little planes that were very light on the maintenance. But the Marines would keep them in active combat through the 80s and active frontline units until finally a replacement was hit upon in the mid and late 80s. The Navy also used these in the Top Gun School for adversary training aircraft. So some were in government service all the way through 1998 and even up to 2000, 2001. The Air Force never used this. This was exclusively a Navy and Marine plane. She was faster than the A1, but about 670 miles per hour, so she still was subsonic. And she had a maximum altitude of a little over 42,000 feet. So a little faster, higher flying than the A1, but couldn't carry quite as much payload. But in many ways was a more modern aircraft. And this is a Hobbymaster model, around 1965-66, Vietnam setup. These are pretty neat. They come with a few different ordnance loadouts. Opening canopy. Fueling probe. Pretty solid little model, all things considered. So yeah, that was the Navy's light attack aircraft. So next, let's go from something very small to something very large. North American A5 Vigilante. So we just looked at a very small, relatively simple, dependable aircraft, quite light. Now we're looking at pretty much its opposite. This is large, was very complex and advanced for its day and time. It also was very maintenance intensive, if also a good plane in its own right. The A4 was designed to be a light attack aircraft with the ability to carry a small tactical nuclear weapon. Well, this wasn't designed really as a ground attack aircraft. It was a carrier-based strategic bomber. It had an internal linear bomb bay to carry a Mark 28 nuke. It could also carry two smaller nukes on the wings, and that was what it was designed for. It was designed to kind of partially replace, supplement Douglas's own A3 Sky Warrior, which itself was a strategic style bomber. And the Vigilante here was first developed and created in the late 50s and started to go into service in 1961. It was briefly known as the A3J, but in 1962 it was designated the A5. A originally. And the idea was basically the A4s could deliver small nuclear tactical weapons from carriers, you know, swarm them with lots of inexpensive light A4s, and these would be delivering the large nuclear bombs. And this was also a very fast aircraft. It was Mach 2 capable. Didn't have a lot of maneuverability, didn't have a lot of turning going on, but it was fast. And it had a much higher altitude of 52,000 feet. No guns, and pretty much its bomb ordnance was for nukes. Had a crew of 2, a pilot, and a bombardier. And for its day and time, it had an early digital computer system, early fly-by-wire, although they did use a mechanical backup, which was good because early on these systems did have some problems. And it was just, you had a lot of advanced avionics for its day and time. It really did. This was good in the sense that they mostly worked. At least when they worked, they were good. But they did require a lot of maintenance and tinkering. But these were just coming into service as strategic bombers in the fleet when in 1963 they had their roles changed. At this time it was decided to kind of take nuclear ordnance off the shoulders of such aircraft and start using Polaris nuclear submarines. Also, of course, you had long-range bombers being flown by the Air Force. So, you know, changing needs and changing tactics. So, most of the Vigilantes, out of the 167 built, 137 were converted or would be just built as this version here, the RA-5C reconnaissance aircraft. And these were operated extensively in Vietnam to kind of fly over a target before and then after a bombing raid to find targets and then monitor the impact. So they had their bomb bay essentially filled in with camera and other surveillance gear. And because of how large these were, they had to operate out of the newest, largest aircraft carriers, such as the Enterprise class nuclear carrier. Anyway, production was generally speaking over in 1963, at least the final orders, but then in 68 they did order around 35 more to replace losses from Vietnam. And then after this was completed in 69, 70, that would be it for production. And they would continue to serve throughout the 1970s, but then would be retired towards the end of 1979. For one thing, their systems, which were so advanced 20 years earlier, were becoming obsolete and harder to maintain. But also, this was such a large aircraft, it took up so much deck and hangar space. Even though carriers were getting bigger, it was just so large, and then they needed to make room for other large aircraft like the F-14 Tomcat. So not a huge production run, but it's a cool plane, and it's kind of on the large end in the A series. But it would just seem kind of odd not to include her. As far as this model from Hobbymaster, your usual features. It is nearly all metal. It's actually very heavy, with opening canopy, with both pilot figures, gears up or down. Kind of wish they would do a nuclear version, but I get why they didn't. That version was in service so briefly, and this version is so much more iconic and flew quite a few hours. But yeah, this was only flown by the Navy. But to me, it's just interesting how they went from such a small little handy aircraft to this thing. It is massive, but you know, different role, different needs. And in every possible way, pretty much the opposite. And by the way, this used the same J79 engine as the F4 Phantom, which is kind of neat. And with that, let's get back to more conventional ground attacking. Grumman's A6 Intruder. This is honestly one of my favorite aircraft of this era, and a model that it took me a while to find. This one, unlike the others we've looked at so far, is from Century Wings. That does have an association with Hobbymaster, but that's a story for another day. Essentially, this is the replacement for the A1 Skyraider. Sorry. They noticed in Korea, the A1, when the weather was good, daylight, no rain, storms, it was great, but a lot of times they couldn't come in to provide close air support because of just lousy weather, or it was just not, it was too dark. So they started working on a true all-weather, day or night, always could fly aircraft. And competitions were held, and Grumman was the winner. And the idea behind it was it needed to be able to have very good low altitude, low speed performance, and be able to deliver ordnance with pinpoint accuracy, because, well, close air support, when you're delivering ordnance that could potentially be very near your own troops, yeah, you want to minimize the whole friendly fire thing. So they started producing these in '63, and they started to be used by first the Navy and then soon the Marine Corps that decade. And then really in 1972, the ultimate version, the A6E, was developed. Originally, this did have a very advanced radar. I mean, being all weather, you'd expect that. It also had multiple computer systems with self-running diagnostics. And then the E really just improved upon this. And they would continue production, low rate, but still production through the 1980s. And the final order for 20 was placed in 1990. And this is a relatively big aircraft. It's classified as a medium attack aircraft. And again, this was for the to replace the A1 Skyraider. It is about 55 feet by 53 feet. Has a crew of 2, pilot and bombardier navigator. It's not really designed for any type of fighting, and by that I mean it has no really air-to-air offensive capability, no cannon at all, and I don't believe they ever put air-to-air missiles on them, but I could be wrong, so correct me if I am. She is faster than, of course, the A1, but actually a little bit slower than the A4. She can't quite get up to 650 miles per hour. She also has a higher altitude than the A1 and slightly higher than the A4 at about 42,500 feet. But where she really shines is with her ordnance. Only having 5 hard points, you might be understood in thinking that she didn't carry a whole lot, but each of those hard points could carry a very massive load, giving her a total loadout, a total payload capacity of up to 18,000 pounds. So double that of the A4 and a couple of tons more than even the A1. Also able to fly faster and higher and deliver them with more accuracy. So she definitely was popular, and the fact that she could fly all the time, day and night, even in the lousiest weather. Sometimes there were reports of these things flying in near hurricane conditions. The only downside, they really needed escort because they had no way to defend themselves and they weren't exactly fast. But with escort, they were able to deliver a lot of ordnance on target for both the Marine Corps and the Navy in the latter stages of the Vietnam War. They were also used over Libya and Liberia in the 1980s, and they were first stationed in the Gulf in 1990 for Operation Desert Shield, and were used extensively during Operation Desert Storm. At that time in 1991, they were kind of looked down upon maybe a little bit as being antiquated, not the newest, fanciest in the fleet, but they got the job done, and they still had very good all-weather capability. She was nearly retired a few times. The Marine Corps would let theirs go around 1993. The Navy would end up keeping theirs in service till about 1997. There were plans to replace her with a plane called the A-12, but budget cuts following the Cold War meant that this did not happen. So the A-6 was kept in service. Grumman would produce just under 700 of these, so a respectable production run. And of course it would also be adapted into an electronics warfare version known as the EA-6B Prowler. But this is the bombing version, and like I said, this model's from Century Wings, and unfortunately aren't in production right now, but it has typical features: ordnance, gear up or down, canopy open with the removable pilot figures, and that's just one of those aircraft that I really like. And it served in the Navy with distinction for multiple generations, and that's just neat. And it finally allowed them to fully retire the A1, as I said earlier, around 1968, because this could do everything it could, plus more, and in conjunction with the A4 and our next aircraft gave the Navy very respectable attack capability. The Vought later LTV, A7 Corsair 2. This is considered a light attack aircraft and was designed originally to replace the A4 in the U.S. Navy and perhaps the Marine Corps, although they ended up not liking the A7 and sticking with the A4. But the Air Force would use it, although somewhat under protest. This is just a interesting aircraft. It's an evolution or adaptation of the Vought F8 Crusader in 1963-64. They had a competition to select a new attack aircraft, and it needed to be based on an existing design, and Vought LTV would win it. So it's basically shorter and wider than the Crusader, and whereas the Crusader was designed to be a fighter, this was designed to be an attack aircraft, essentially light bomber. It's about 46 feet long and 39 feet wide, so it is larger than the A4, but still smaller than the A6. And it has just one crew member, top speed of about 690 miles per hour, so a little faster, but still subsonic, barely. And a max altitude of 42,000 some odd feet. Again, like most of these, it's designed for maneuverability at lower altitudes and whatnot. High altitudes just aren't really the point of these aircraft. Unlike the A6, it does have a cannon. Originally, it would be equipped with the Colt Mark 12 20mm cannon. But with this version here, the A7D, they would introduce the Air Force's M61A1 rotary barrel cannon with over 1,000 rounds. So it did have some defense. It also had two hard points on the fuselage or chin for air-to-air missiles, typically Sidewinders. And then it had 6 more hard points, 3 under each wing, for air-to-surface ordnance, guided or otherwise, or additional fuel tanks. It could carry up to 15,000 pounds, so a good bit more than the A4. And it was the first U.S. Navy aircraft to have a heads-up display. It also had a very advanced autopilot for its day and time. The autopilot could fly to predetermined preset waypoints. It could also basically land the aircraft. And because it was based on an existing design, development was pretty straightforward and simple. Now, how did this become an Air Force plane? How it became a Navy plane makes sense. They started flying these in Vietnam in 1967 or thereabouts, and flew them through the end of the war, allowing them to phase out older aircraft. But in the Air Force, they didn't really want this. The Air Force, by this time, was really fixated on fighters. The higher-ups, there was what was called as the fighter mafia, and even the pilots kind of looked down, usually on ground attack aircraft. But the Army could not operate fixed-wing aircraft, so they had to rely on the Air Force to provide support to their troops on the ground. And the Air Force had been using the F-100 Super Sabre and some of the A-1 hand-me-downs for this role, and they weren't really satisfied. They thought something new was needed, so the pressure was put on the Air Force. Well, Robert McNamara pretty much twisted the Air Force's arm, saying, hey, we just developed this new A7 for the Navy. Use it, we'll make your own version. So in '65 they announced they were going with what would become the A7D, which had some updates and upgrades for the Air Force's needs, including switching the cannon. They would start flying these prototypes in '68, and they would start to go into service around 1970, being used heavily in the last couple of years of Vietnam. In fact, the A7D with its new engine and everything was so successful that the Navy ended up essentially adopting it too, slightly tailored to its own needs, is the A7E. And LTV would continue producing these until the final run in 1984, building nearly 1,600, so not bad. Pretty good little run for them. So this shows you why the Air Force was kind of not really up on attack aircraft. And they had their, of course, strategic bombers and all that, but when it came to the smaller planes, they really liked their fighters. They had plenty of fighter bombers too, like the F-105. It's a little bit different of a system. Anyway, after Vietnam, they started to pull these out of service in 74, at least frontline, but they ended up taking new examples, including a two-seat version, pretty much by order of Congress in the late 70s and early 80s. So they kept the A-7D in the Air Force around through the 80s, mostly using it for Air Guard and training. And the Air Guard did deploy it in 1989 during the invasion of Panama. But that was pretty much its last major operation with the Air Force. They did not use it in the Gulf War. But the Navy did. They still like the A-7. They used it to support Marine troops during Grenada. And they did use it during the 1991 Gulf War, although this would be the A-7's last combat outing. Thus, after the Gulf War in 91, both the Air Force and Navy would officially retire the Corsair, and then the Air National Guard would retire theirs a couple of years later. One kind of fun fact, these were used to support the SR-71, first to support the Deception, and then later to actually help conversion training for pilots to the SR-71, because it was a subsonic plane designed to be a ground attacker. Even though they called the F-117 a fighter, it was a bomber, or at least a ground attacker too. So they did have roles. And it was another quite modern aircraft with several new modern features. Again, mostly to do with the autopilot and the cockpit layout. And 15,000 pounds and the ability to deliver them. These were known for quite accurate delivery of ordnance. And they had a good record. They used the same engine as the F-111 and early F-14. But since their roles were different from the F-14s, it worked a lot better for them. But unfortunately, it was one of the last Vought military aircraft. So, since the Marine Corps did not want the A-7, what did they want? McDonnell-Douglas / British Aerospace AV-8 Harrier 2, or specifically the AV-8B Plus. The Marine Corps was very satisfied with their A4s. Like I said, they even had their own version, the A4M, which really was kind of the pinnacle of the Skyhawk. But by the 1970s, they knew they wouldn't last forever. Between 71 and 76, the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Navy took delivery of some British Harriers. They were GR3s, designating them as AV-8A, so Attack Vertical 8. They love especially the Marine Corps, the versatility of being able to do short takeoff and landing, or even vertical takeoff and landing if required. But the original GR3 AV-8A could only carry about half of what the A4 could. Plus, it was a little difficult to fly and had some other mechanical issues. Therefore, in 1973, work began on an improved version, and this was a joint project between the US and UK, and there is so much politicking. Not only did Britain drop out, rejoin, yada yada, the US Navy was very resistant. The Marine Corps had to twist their arm, and there was a bunch of back and forth fighting in Congress over this. Finally, in 81, the new version was more or less funded, and so prototypes were made, and it started to enter service in 1985, replacing the A4 and a few other aircraft. And basically, this is just a more capable version of the original Harrier. Has a larger wing. It can carry quite a bit more ordnance, over 9,000 pounds. It also has longer range and ability to stay on station for a longer period of time, and so on and so forth. A more advanced cockpit with better visibility. She's about 46 feet long, but only about 30 feet wide. So a little bit longer than the A4, but not a whole lot bigger, really. She has 6 hard points under the wings, 3 under each, plus a center line, and can carry a 25mm cannon. And has a max speed of 690 miles per hour, so she's still subsonic. And a max altitude, like many of the rest, around 46,000 feet. So she started in her service in the 80s. Then they started working on a night capable version. Originally it was pretty much not night vision compatible, and these were ready for service and were first deployed in 1990 for Operation Desert Shield, and then for the Gulf War in 91 they were kind of held in reserve so they could be sent to support troops on the ground where needed, rapid response, and had a pretty good record for their debut. And then between 93 and 95 they worked on the AV-8B and then AV-8B Plus programs for upgrading to the existing standard, fully nights capable, so on and so forth, new ordnance. The last brand new airframe was delivered for what would become Boeing in 1997, with the last of the Marine Corps planes upgraded and redelivered in 2003, and they would produce 337 of these. And this is pretty well exclusive to the Marine Corps. The Navy wasn't interested. Obviously the Air Force wasn't. This was a Navy plane, a Marine plane, and it shows. Of course, they continued to use these all throughout Afghanistan and Iraq, and pretty much just either hitting targets on the ground or providing close support for Marine troops. Plus, these could operate from forward bases with very short, rough runways, or even using the vertical takeoff if absolutely necessary. Of course, if they did this, it would consume a lot of fuel, and they couldn't lift as much ordnance, but it was an option. So, even though production's over, these are still in service. Originally, the planned retirement for the AV-8B Plus was 2030. But since the F-35B finally got its act together, now they're thinking they'll have them replaced by 2025. The F-35B did start to replace these around 2016, but that whole program's been relatively slow going, to say the least. But yeah, this is what they wanted instead of the A7 over here, and it finally let them retire their trusty old A4s. And you can see a lot of similarities: tough, rugged, relatively small, Not a huge payload, but enough to meet their needs for the Marine Corps. And for more on this, if you like to talk Harriers, I've done many Harrier videos in the past, and we'll probably still do more in the future. With that, let's move on to a few more modern aircraft. Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II. But we all know it and call it, affectionately, the Warthog. This is an Air Force plane through and through, and a very unique one at that. As I said earlier, the Air Force had this mentality, from the pilots up to the generals, even some of the lobbyists, that they really wanted to stick to fighters. But they couldn't deny that the A-7D had worked well for them in the latter stages of Vietnam and was a useful asset. But it was a Navy plane. The F-4D and E that they were flying were adapted from Navy planes, and they had inherited A-1s from the Navy. So if they were going to get another close air support ground attack aircraft, it was going to be theirs. So around 1970, competitions, well, the outlines for competitions were laid out, and it was pretty quickly down selected to two. You had the Republic YA-10 and the Northrop YA-9. But on top of that, just as important as the airframe was the cannon, the GA-8 cannon, which was to be a 30mm cannon. And honestly, the airframe was designed around this cannon. General Electric was selected to make it, and as of course you know, the Republic YA-10 was selected for production, and so that, after some final testing, would begin in 74, and then by 77 the new A-10A would begin replacing the A-7D in the Air Force. And they did have some early problems with stress and whatnot, having to rework this and that. But all in all, it was designed to be a cost-effective, very durable, very survivable aircraft, and it was very effective at that. It's not small, though. It's about 53 feet by 57.5 feet. And you can really tell that it was designed to be a modern replacement for the A-1. It has 11 hardpoints, able to carry up to 16,000 pounds of ordnance, and it has that big honking rotary barrel 30mm cannon firing depleted uranium bullets, and it can carry nearly 1,200 rounds for it when fully loaded, although they would very rarely load a plane up that much. It was faster than the A-1, but it only had a top speed of about 440 miles per hour and liked to cruise quite a bit slower than that. And it had a top altitude of about 45,000 feet. For air-to-air defense, it would often carry a pair of Sidewinder missiles on the wing, together there. But this was in no way a dogfighter. Way too slow. It had very good maneuverability and handling at low altitudes and low speeds, though. But this was basically a flying artillery piece or flying tank. It had a lot of armor, including especially around the cockpit and glass. It was designed to take hits from shells up to 23mm or greater. The fuel tanks were well protected. It was even designed where if the landing gear system failed, it could land with gear up, doing minimal damage. It has 2 engines, so even if one got knocked out, she could keep flying. And she could even fly with a good portion of her wing blown off. It's a very durable aircraft. And of course, all of her electronics and everything were designed for, bombing and aiming and what have you. And they designed it to be very serviceable in the field, easy to swap parts. They even went to the trouble of making sure as many parts as possible weren't left-hand, right-hand specific. Things like that. Little thoughtful gestures. And it was designed to operate from forward bases with very rough airfields. And it's a relatively short takeoff and landing aircraft, too. It doesn't need much runway to get going. This plane is very interesting and cool. Mainly because it's different. This is the only one of its type in the Air Force. It's the only one designed specifically with the primary role of close air support ground attack. And then around 86, 87, they developed a version known as the OA-10, which is a forward observer control, basically targeting aircraft variant 2. The first time they really were put in harm's way was 1983. They were there to help support the Marine landing at Grenada, but they never fired their weapons in anger because there was no real resistance. So they have to wait until the 1991 Gulf War. Now, over the 1980s, there were a few problems with the Warthog. They were able to work them out, but they existed. But many in the Air Force, again, that fighter mafia group was still around, saying, we don't really need this. We have this new F-16. It can deliver ordnance. Let's just replace the A-10 with a attack variant F-16. But then the Gulf War happened. And their combat debut, A-10s blew up 900 Iraqi tanks, which was from the beginning one of its primary missions. The idea was if the Soviets ever invaded Europe through the Fulda Gap, these could take out Soviet tanks. So that was the main reason for the big cannon, frankly. Well, that didn't happen, thankfully, but hey, Iraq had some Soviet tanks, and hey, they were enemies, so we've got this big gun, might as well use it. And that's really one of the interesting things about the A-10. Its gun was a primary thing. It wasn't a secondary thought like the M61 and the A7. But of course it carried plenty of other munitions, rocket pods, M82 bombs, Mavericks, and of course they would start to be equipped with lightning pods and whatnot, targeting pods too. As if 900 tanks wasn't enough, they destroyed 1,200 artillery pieces and support vehicles, and they destroyed about 2,000 other vehicles that just happened to get in their way, from dune buggies to trucks to tankers to whatever. So all told, they destroyed over 4,000 pieces of Iraqi equipment in the war. After this very successful debut, the idea of replacing it with the F-16 pretty much went out the window. Instead, they began upgrading and updating these in the 1990s. They would be flown over Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1994-95, and then they would also be used in Kosovo in 1999. And they would first be deployed to Afghanistan early in 2002, although they would have to wait to go back to Iraq. The A-10 would not be deployed to Iraq until 2007. That's because around 2005, an upgrade program was underway. The A-10A was the only production model, but in the early 21st century, several updates to its avionics, communication, weapons were introduced, resulting in the A-10C, as you see here. So basically the same plane, just updated. By this point, all of the existing A-10s have been updated. And production is long over, but the ones that are in service are still very much working because, again, these were designed to be durable and reliable. They would build about 715, including prototypes, many of which are still flying today. I mean, some have been lost through attrition and accidents, and even a few in combat, but the majority are still available in the Air Force. And the idea, after these were used in Operation Odyssey Dawn in 2011, They thought, well, we might start replacing these with this newfangled F-35A, much like they thought about replacing them with the F-16 earlier, but in reality, this isn't practical. Therefore, no one really knows when the Warthog might go out of Air Force service. The date 2040 is sometimes batted around, but the fact is it flies, and there's nothing else in the inventory that really can do its job. The Army has the AH-64 Apache, but aside from helicopters, when you're talking fixed-wing aircraft, there's not a whole lot else like it. As far as this Hobbymaster model, this is one of Hobbymaster's older toolings. It's got a lot of metal in it. Canopy hinges open. One odd thing about their A-10s, they don't come with a pilot. Then any of the Hobbymaster pilots drop right in. And they come with loads of ordnance you can plug on. Different models have different ones. And one thing I think is kind of neat, the big tires on these are rubber. So, yeah, just like the originals. I don't know. It's a Warthog. And I've done a video or two on these. So, the Air Force has a dedicated close air support aircraft. What about the Navy and Marine Corps? The McDonnell-Douglas FA-18 Hornet. Well, the Air Force got a very dedicated ground attack close support aircraft in the A-10. The Navy and Marines went a different direction. In the 1970s, the F-14 was getting expensive, and proposed replacements were getting just as expensive. Long story short, the Air Force just had the competition that selected the F-16, but its competitor, the YF-17, was still kind of on the table, and essentially the government ordered the Navy, instead of using a lot of money, post-Vietnam budget cuts being what they were, kind of pick between the two. We can make a navalized version of the F-16 or the YF-17. They didn't like the F-16 because it had a single tire front landing gear, and it was a single engine. They felt more comfortable with dual engine for carrier operations. So they selected the YF-17, announced this in 1975, and began working on an extensive refit to navalize it, really changing the frame quite a bit. This resulted in the F-18 fighter. And originally there was to be 3 variants: the F-18 fighter, the A-18 attack, and the TF-18 trainer. The F-18 was to support the F-14, kind of like how the F-16 supported the F-15 in the Air Force. And the A-18 was to replace the A-4 in the Marine Corps and the A-7 in the Navy. So testing began in '78. The Navy and the Marine Corps both tested the new plane, but then they realized that new digital avionics, new computer systems, they could probably combine into one plane. Thus, around 1980, the nomenclature FA-18 started to be used, fighter attack, kind of having a swing role aircraft. The A was the single seat, and the B would be the two-seater. And this was made official in 1984. And this is when the aircraft started to go into first Marine and then Navy service, allowing older aircraft to be pulled out. The combat debut was in 1986 over Libya, where they performed both as fighters and attack aircraft. And then in 87, the original A and B models were replaced with updated C and D variants, which were essentially just modernized computers, avionics. This was the first Navy aircraft to have multi-function displays, but originally they were monochrome, think an Apple IIe. Well, with the CD variants, they were color, and then a couple of years later they would add night goggle compatibility as well. And both the Navy and Marine Corps deployed the FA-18 Hornet in the Iraq War in 1991, and again using them both as fighters and bombers, or attack aircraft. Basically, with the push of a button, they could change the modes, going from delivering air-to-air munitions to air-to-surface. So what do we have here? She's a decently small aircraft for modern time, 56 feet by 40 feet. Has a top speed of Mach 1.8, but it is 2 engines. They're not all that great. I mean, I don't want to say, but they're not revolutionarily forward-thinking engines, but they are dependable and reliable. And she can get up to about 50,000 feet altitude. It's a respectable enough fighter. She has a total of 9 hard points, carrying 13.7 thousand pounds of munitions. So more than the Harrier, but less than many other aircraft. And she has an M61A1 20mm cannon with 500 to 600 rounds of ammunition. She's actually designed to be quite maneuverable and agile. That's kind of why she has this uniquely designed tail setup. And, you know, like any compromised dual-role aircraft, she's not as advanced of a fighter as, say, the F-14. But, you know, a lot cheaper to operate. And it has a very low maintenance cost. And air-to-air fighting is just proven far less critical in recent decades. She doesn't have quite the bomb load of a A7 or A6, but still over 13,000 pounds is respectable. And they would build just under 1,500 of these, with FA-18CD production ending in 2000. The last FA-18D was delivered to the Marine Corps in August of that year. They were used throughout the 90s in Bosnia, over Kosovo. They were early on the scene for Afghanistan in late 2001, and were used in the initial stages of the Iraq War in 2003. Again, as both fighter and bomber, fighter and attack aircraft. The Navy tended to operate the A and later the C, but the Marine Corps liked operating the D, which this is a Marine variant here, especially when it was more of a ground attack mission. They found the extra seat, the extra person to be useful for navigating and aiming and what have you. So, a pretty successful story. Of course, later on, McDonnell-Douglas would be folded into Boeing, and this would evolve into the FA-18E and F Super Hornet, which I did consider bringing out, but I think this does the purpose. The Navy retired the FA-18C in 2018. It had its final mission, with retirement ceremony in 2019. But the Marine Corps still operates the FA-18D and plans to do so for quite a while longer, maybe until about 2030. It suits their needs. So They have the Harriers for more of a light attack role. This is more of a medium attack role for the Marines. And of course, the F-35B is coming into Marine service, and the F-35C is coming into Navy service. But definitely an iconic carrier-based aircraft, and has proven quite successful. But it's interesting that it was an outgrowth of the YF-17, and that the joint fighter attack thing was a pretty late addition to the design. But obviously this was not an Air Force design. It's Marine and Navy. And it's neat that it can change its role with the push of a button, though. And that's kind of where we're at today with attackers. The FA-18 first allowed the A4 and the A7 to be taken out of service. Later, the A6. For a time, Lightning Pod equipped Tomcats took over, but of course now those are retired as well. And the Hornet and Super Hornet live on. Well, let's have a few final thoughts. And there we have it. It's kind of interesting to look at the different attitudes the branches had over the 20th century and into the 21st. While the Air Force was kind of reluctant to operate attack aircraft, close air support type aircraft, light bombers even, really preferring more fighters, the Navy, ever since before World War II, was always happy to operate things like torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and how that really did evolve into the A1, kind of being the ultimate expression of that, but also the first of the new. And from there, you know, we had various jets, light and medium, and that seemed to dictate how much they could carry, but also if they had a cannon or not. And to the modern day, they're not so much worried about tactical use, you know, nuclear delivery or even large targets, more focused on tank busting and the like. And of course, again, like with the Harrier, providing close, rapid response support to troops on the ground. And again, if you find any of these particularly interesting, I've done individual videos on each, so you might like to check those out. Well, as always, feel free to comment. I greatly appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.